Imagine an ancient Viking sword so cursed the last 3 people who touched it passed away mysteriously, or a runestone with carvings so unsettling it was buried under concrete to keep something from getting out, not in. The Ulfber's sword that shouldn't exist. In 2008, German archaeologists unearthed a Viking sword near the Weser River, unlike anything they had ever seen. The sword, believed to be over 1,000 years old, was found embedded in clay during field plowing. Now, X-rays revealed the inscription, which I'm gonna butcher this, but it's like Velbert, something like that. Sorry if I got that completely wrong. Now, this indicates it's one of the highly valued swords, known for their exceptional quality and Frankish origin. Now, this weapon was made of such pure high carbon steel, it shouldn't have been possible to create for another 800 years. Now, here's the kicker. Modern metallurgists say the sword matches the strength and purity of steel made using industrial methods, not medieval ones. That's like finding an iPhone buried in a Roman ruin. Now, some believe these swords were crafted using technology that came from, well, somewhere else. Possibly even the Middle East, through secret trade or something even stranger. Now, the scariest part? Several collectors and researchers who've tried to replicate the sword have reported disturbing dreams, sudden illnesses, and in one case, an unexplained fire that destroyed an entire lab. Museums now store, the original sword deep in archives, citing security concerns. The sword will undergo, though, kind of conservation and further study to determine its exact age and analyze the inscription in more detail. The Kilver stone. This is the runestone that was buried for a good reason. In 1903, on the island of Gotland in Sweden, archaeologists uncovered a flat stone in a young boy's grave. It was inscribed with a full Elder Futhark, which is the oldest known runic alphabet. Now, the Kilver stone was found during the excavation of a cemetery near a farm. Now, in 1903, the stone was a flat limestone rock used to seal a grave, and the inscription was written on the underside and could therefore not be read from above. The dating of the stone from 400 CE is based upon the archaeological dating of the graves. Now, here's where it gets a little unsettling. The final ruin on the Kilver stone resembles a bind ruin, often associated with curses. The stone was quickly kind of reburied by locals, but not because it was irrelevant, but because of what followed. A string of bizarre demises in the excavation team, including one man who reportedly gouged out his own eyes before passing. That led to rumors that the stone was indeed cursed. Locals claim the ruins weren't just a memorial, but a binding spell meant to trap a malevolent spirit within the grave. Now, Swedish museums now list the Kilver stone as, kind of archived, but rarely mention it in exhibitions. Even scholars debate whether displaying it could release whatever it was meant to hold. The Kilver stone was removed from Gotland and brought to the Swedish Museum of National Antiques in Stockholm, where it is on display as of 2022. So if you want to go take a look at it, you know where to go. The Viking Buddha of Helgo. Now, this one will mess with your idea of history. In 1954, archaeologists excavating the Swedish island of Helgo discovered a small bronze statue of the Buddha. Yes, Buddha. Dated to around the 6th century AD, the figure somehow traveled thousands of miles from India or possibly China all the way to Viking territory, centuries before global trade routes were even formalized. Now, this bronze statuette of the Buddha stands about 8.4 centimeters tall. Specialists in Buddhist, kind of iconography suggest that it was manufactured in northwest India, perhaps, sometimes around the 6th century CE. What makes the item special, though, is that it was excavated on a small island in Sweden, just west of Stockholm. Now, in the mid-1950s, excavations began on the eastern end of the island of Helgo. Now, the excavators found evidence for occupation from the 4th century CE to the 11th century CE. In July of 1956, excavators uncovered the Buddha in an indistinct lair outside the remains of one of the structures on the site. Now, the site, located on a series of terraces on a hillside, was challenging to excavate and, also interpret. So how did a Viking, end up with a Buddha statue? Well, some believe it was looted from a shipwreck or passed through an unknown global network, but others say it points to a suppressed history of Viking contact with, distinct civilizations and spiritual exchanges where, we've never been told about. The statue is held now by the Swedish History Museum, but it's rarely displayed. I mean, according to insiders, the museum avoids putting it on, exhibit because it just raises too many unanswerable questions. Would you go visit it? If you could, let me know. If you have or want to or plan to, I would love to hear about your your experience. The Oseberg Viking tapestry that depicts something else. The Oseberg tapestry, a fragment of which was found in the Oseberg ship burial, is a source of mystery due to its fragmented nature and the unique depictions it basically contains. Now, the tapestry, made of wool, silk, and flax, is one of the few surviving examples of Viking Age textiles and features scenes of humans, animals, and wheeled vehicles. Now, the original size and full narrative of the tapestry remain unknown, prompting ongoing research and interpretation. When the Oseberg ship burial was excavated in Norway in 1904, archaeologists found something incredible, this preserved tapestry. But this wasn't just Viking embroidery. No, hidden in the artwork were strange, haunting figures like horned beasts, masked men, and what looked eerily like human sacrifice. Experts initially dismissed the imagery as symbolic, but decades later, researchers noticed something very chilling. The scenes in the tapestry didn't match known Norse myths. Some of the figures resembled Egyptian gods, others matched beings described in Celtic or even, Mesopotamian lore. Now, the tapestry includes depictions of horned helmets, which are rare in Viking art, and scenes that may depict rituals or possessions, adding to its enigmatic nature. Now, the tapestry may be evidence of forgotten Viking rituals or proof that, they encountered civilizations far beyond what historians admit. And the worst theory, well, the figures might not be metaphorical at all, but depictions of real beings the Vikings encounter. The tapestry is now kept in controlled storage at the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo. Now, it's never been fully displayed, not because it's damaged, but because interpretation remains inconclusive and very sensitive. Researchers are using computer algorithms and AI to analyze the fragments and piece them together, hoping to gain a better understanding of the tapestry's original form and meaning. So stay locked in to see what more information comes out about this artifact. I'm sure it will. The Oseberg burial ship, however, contained a very rich collection of grave goods, including 2 female skeletons and a variety of artifacts, suggesting the women were of high social status. These items include textiles, household and farm equipment, a wooden cart, 4 sleighs, and 5 carved animal heads. The ship itself, along with many of the artifacts, is remarkably well preserved and on display at the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo. The Seeress staff that was quietly removed from display. Now, in 1961, a Viking woman's grave was unearthed in northern Norway. Inside was an iron staff, about a foot long with an oddly curled end. It looked like nothing else from that period. At first, it was labeled a distaff used in weaving, but folklore researchers had other ideas. A vulva was a seeress or sorceress in Norse culture, feared and revered for her connection to the deceased and the gods. The most distinctive feature of these burials is the presence of an iron staff, often with bronze ornamentation. Now, these staffs, also called seer staffs, are believed to have been tools for divination and magic rituals. When the staff was displayed briefly in the Tromsø Museum, strange things started happening. Lights flickered, alarms went off at night, a security guard refused to enter the exhibit alone after claiming he had heard chanting in Old Norse. The staff was quietly pulled from the exhibit and moved to secure storage. Officially, the museum cites artifact degradation, but insiders say the staff is considered too spiritually charged for public view. Vulva burials are often found among the graves of wealthy and high-status individuals, indicating their respected position in Viking society. These Viking artifacts aren't just fascinating, they're deeply disturbing. I mean, whether it's technology that shouldn't exist, runes that whisper warnings, or spiritual relics that still radiate power centuries later, one thing is clear, some pieces, of the Viking world were never meant to be put under glass.
Number 5. The Sword of Dainsleif. The Sword of Dainsleif, and hey, there's a good chance I'm pronouncing that wrong, so let me know, is among the most famous of weapons in Nordic myths, a legendary cursed sword of yore. Dainsleif was the blade of King Hadingus, who was a noble king in ancient Viking stories. The Dainsleif sword was handcrafted by the dwarf Dane, who is said to be among the most skilled craftsmen in all of the realms. The name of the sword literally translates to Dane's legacy. However, the sword had been imbued with a dark, powerful magic energy. Whenever the mighty Dainsleif was drawn, it could not be sheathed until blood had coated its blade. Someone had to die to feed the thirst of blood that quelled inside the tempered steel. Not just that too, but this cursed sword must have had a very specific hunger pang for neck blood, as the sword had to behead an enemy. Sounds like an extremely high maintenance cursed sword. Surely all blood tastes the same, right? To a sword? I don't know, maybe I'm being dismissive. The sword features prominently in the story of Prose Edda, an ancient Nordic textbook thought to date back from the 12th century, which told the story of King Hogni and his beautiful daughter Hild, while he warred in the eternal battle of the kings. According to this old story, Hogni came to meet other kings across the land, and brought his daughter to introduce them. However, a jealous rival king seized his daughter and stole her away. Hogni gathered as many of his most fearsome warriors as he could to reclaim her, and sailed west in pursuit of his daughter. He found her on an island, yet her captor had attempted to persuade Hogni into making peace with him. But Hogni told him it was too late to end that. I mean, makes sense, you stole my daughter, bro. But the Dainsleif had been drawn, and it couldn't be sheathed until he'd been beheaded. The legend then goes on to state that the two men fought for 143 years. But I'm hoping they took like 2 15-minute breaks a day at least. And my ghouls and goblins, if you love the scares we put out for you, the nicest way to show thanks is to toss a little like and subscribe our way. If you're already subscribed, you're the coolest. If you're not, well, I still like you lots, but you could really win me over with a like and subscribe. Just saying, if you wanted to get on my good side. Number 4, runes of power. To the Vikings, runes and runic magic were a cornerstone of their culture. Runes were their language, after all, their written language. The old poem Havamal explains that Odin, the Allfather, discovered the runes when he hung himself from the world tree, Yggdrasil, in order to attain enlightenment. As he hung on the tree, blowing for 9 nights and 9 days, he found himself slowly fading away, ready to be taken away to hell, when as he was about to die, he found the runes, took them, and earned his life, and bestowed them to humanity. Carving a rune into an object imbued it with a great deal of power. With the right inscriptions and the aid of a powerful seeress or sorceress, you could predict the future, protect yourself, or your family from misfortune. You could even imbue a blade with powerful energy. Skyrim got that right exactly. As well, runes were said to be the key to activating conjurations, curses, and spells, but as well, runic inspirations were found to bless just everyday things. Oftentimes, they told stories within them too. Runestones were also used in Viking culture as landmarks, and the inscriptions they bore contained powerful magic within them. Take the Glavendrup stone, which contains a powerful warning to anyone who dares to move it. Listen to what it says. Ragnhildr placed this stone in memory of Ali the Pale, priest of the sanctuary, honorable thane of the retinue. Ali's sons made the monument in memory of their father, and his wife in memory of her husband, and Soti carved these runes in memory of his lord. Thor, hallow these runes. A warlock be he who damages this stone, drags it in memory of another. So this runestone's got a little curse put in place to make sure no one disturbs the slumber of Ali the Pale. Perhaps one of the most famous runestones in the world is the Björktorp runestone in Sweden. A mysterious runestone whose purpose is not fully known, but bears another frightening inscription. Listen to this one, and I gotta put a bit of a voice on for this one, you'll understand. I, master of the runes, conceal here runes of power. Incessantly plagued by maleficence, doomed to insidious death is he who breaks this monument. Do forgive me, but can you imagine me just reading that normal? Would not have worked. So we might not know what the Björktorp runestone is for, but we can say with certainty no one is willing to move it to find out what might be built on top of it, just in case runic magic is real and they don't want to experiment with dooming themselves to an insidious death plagued by malfeasance. That sounds terrible. Number 3, the Nidaros Cathedral. The Nidaros Cathedral is a popular tourist hotspot in Norway. Renowned for its beautiful architecture, it's a stunning monument to Norway's very rich history, and it's also quite known as one of the more haunted buildings in the entire country. It's located in the city center of Trondheim, named after the Trondheim Nidaros, which was the capital of Norway during the era of Vikings. In the early days, it was a humble, simple wooden chapel built to serve as the tomb of Saint Olaf, a Viking king who helped introduce Christianity to Viking culture and would be remembered as the patron saint of Norway. It was the traditional location for the consecration of new kings of Norway. Now, if you're looking at this and you think, wow, what a building, that's because it took 230 years to build it, so I would hope it looks great. From the years 1070 to 1300, it was worked on round the clock. Now let's get into the most important part, and the only part we even care about this building is the ghost. I just spent so much time talking about architectural history when we could be talking about a ghost. Norway's most famous famous ghost is known as the Monk, and he's an apparition that manifests as a medieval monk with a bloody gash along its throat, dripping onto the floor. The Monk's first sighting was in 1924, and since then has become a bit of a staple of the cathedral, with countless sightings and tourists reporting hearing, seeing, or feeling the monk around the cathedral. The first sighting was from a bishop's wife during service, and she claims that she saw the monk standing behind the congregation with bright glowing blue eyes. She said his face was sharp and glowing, and when he raised his hand, that blood started to pour from his throat. The priest who was tending to the service at the time claims that while he was speaking, he felt an unspeakable pain in his throat, as if something was lodged in it. Number 2. Viking graves. Now, the Vikings were a very superstitious people. Ghosts were a very common belief and possible threat in medieval Norway. Your soul could go just about all over. You might end up in Valhall, the realm of Odin, where you can drink and fight to your heart's content for eternity. Or you could end up in Folkvanger, Freya's realm, a lush, bountiful field that sprawled forever. Or you could end up in Helheim, which was just a terrible, cold, dismal place. Imagine spending your entire life in freezing Scandinavia, dying, and then waking up in a different freezing afterlife. I would be so upset. Of course, if you didn't qualify for any of these afterlife options, you could always end up with your soul trapped on the earth and reanimated as a ghost or a corpse zombie monster called a Draugr, which anyone who spent too much time inside of any of Skyrim's caves can tell you are a real nuisance. So Vikings had to come up with all sorts of ways to make sure that nobody came back to cause any problems for the village. No doubt you've heard of Viking funerary ships or their pyres, where their dead were sent off into the water in a longboat with possessions that might befit them in the afterlife, and then lit ablaze with an arrow. But oftentimes, that was more for higher caste members of society. Other burials were traditional, but the body was kept in the home for a few days to prepare. The Vikings took all sorts of fun precautions to make sure they wouldn't have a Draugr on their hands. The head was wrapped in bandages. Oftentimes the feet would be bound or sewn together, or even needles would be placed into the feet to make sure just in case they came back to life they wouldn't be able to walk. Corpses were brought into houses feet first because they believed the spirit of the person would not be able to see where they were being taken for burial and thus unable to find their way back home. If they had the time too, Vikings would build something really fun called a corpse door, an opening they built into a home which was bricked up, and when the burial was ready would be smashed through and the dead would be carried through this feet first. The belief was that the reanimated could only enter their home from the way they had left, so if there was no corpse door anymore, the Draugr wouldn't be able to get in and it would just sort of paw at the door like a sad cat. Honestly, the logic is there. This one makes complete sense to me. And number 1, the Dorset grave. The Dorset mass grave is one of the scariest and confusing archaeological discoveries ever discovered. Let me ask you, what's more fun than a barrel of monkeys? You might be thinking a barrel of Vikings? No, I'm thinking about a mass grave full of headless Viking bodies. No? Okay, well you and I find different things very fun, I suppose. Way back, all the way back in 2008, a group of archaeologists were on a fairly routine digging operation in Dorset, a quaint little seaside town in England. They were supervising a digging operation to improve local roads and were on set to see if there was anything of note to find. You know, maybe an old coin or an arrowhead. And for the first few days of the job, nothing noteworthy was really coming up until they came across the mass pile of 54 entangled Viking corpses, all missing their heads. I guess that was kind of noteworthy. If it was just a bunch of headless Viking bodies, that would be one thing, but the mass grave was just riddled in confusing details. Their skulls were missing, but as well, their rib cages, arm, and leg bones were all scattered around, surrounded by discarded teeth. There were no clothes or weaponry to be found at all. So what in Odin's name happened here, because absolutely nothing I can imagine is pleasant. My first thought is that this was some sort of insane Event Horizon-esque scenario where a bunch of Vikings opened up a portal to hell and had a blood party. The teeth found around the grave had all been filed down neatly as if a craftsman had done it. Now it goes without saying that, Viking dental surgery was not going to be a painless process, meaning this had to be excruciating, suggesting it was either done by a very careful tormentor or it was done to themselves to intimidate opponents by showing how gritty and fierce they are. Could not tell you which one is better. Now, as good as my theory about a bunch of Vikings opening up a Hellraiser scenario or something is, archaeologists had some different ideas. They theorized that looking at the wounds on the ribs and the torso, that they were very surgical blows, which isn't really what you'd expect from a rabid Viking brawl. The archaeologists thought that these men were either offered up as part of a horrifying sadistic ritual, or it was a big-time mass sentencing where everybody was rounded up and sentenced to death. Explains too where all the weapons and gear had gone, as these men had been brought here and then left there for a very, very long time. Anyone else feel like that also kind of sounds like it might be the world's most terrifying puzzle to try and put together, trying to figure out where all those bones go? Maybe just me? Maybe I've been working on this channel too long and my sense of humor has been changed permanently.
Kicking off at number 5, Vinland. And no, not the Scandinavian nation of Finland, although that awesome country has as much deeply seated history as the best of them. This story is about a much more different destination. You see, the Vikings were remarkable explorers, and the art of experiencing the unknown parts of the planet was perhaps one of the most important figures in Viking society. So then, it would make sense that the Vikings managed to make landfall in North America nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus was even born, right? In fact, it is widely considered that the legendary Viking explorer Leif Erikson led the first ever European voyage to touch North American soil. You see, by the year 985 AD, Greenland had been relatively settled by Leif's father, Eric the Red, who had been banished from Norway for committing manslaughter. Leif grew up with a thirst for exploration, and it was around 1000 AD that he turned his sights toward the mystery of the West. After crossing the rest of the Atlantic, he discovered what is now Canada, a rocky and barren land which could have been Baffin Island, but the Vikings dubbed it Helleland, Norwegian for stone slab land. Eventually, when they got further inland, they discovered a much more lush and bountiful region filled with salmon and wild grapes that they named Vinland, Wineland. They spent a winter or so here before returning home, telling everyone how awesome it was. Now, because of that, several parties tried to sail there and settle permanently, the most famous of which being a site at the northernmost tip of Newfoundland at Lance aux Meadows, where archaeologists have discovered numerous evidence of their settlement. You see, after all of this exploration, though, the Vikings hadn't paid much attention to the natives that had lived there for thousands of years already. First, Leif's brother Thorwald Eriksson was killed in a skirmish with a nearby native tribe, and then several years later, another group of Vikings were mercilessly killed in the Battle of Vinland in the year 1010. As an old legend goes, the final nail in the coffin for the Vikings' time in North America came when a small group of fishermen woke up in their coastal camp only to find that their leader had been beheaded in the night by the natives, his head skewered on a stake as a warning never to return. Swinging in at number 4, the death of Hadingus. Now, whilst there are many legendary Danish kings from history, the majority of them are renowned for their lives as bloodthirsty warriors and daring tacticians. Hadingus, though, this guy is far more renowned for his death, more so than anything else. Although, to give him credit, he was a pretty legendary warrior and leader either way. It's just that, well, you'll find out. From the off, Hadingus was thrust into a life of violent circumstance. His father, King Gram of Denmark, rocked up to the wedding of a Finnish princess, Signe, and her intended husband, Henry, King of Saxony. Obviously, it was love at first sight, as Gram killed Henry on the spot and then took Signe back to Denmark, where she eventually gave birth to their son, Hadingus. Obviously, Gram had quite a few enemies at this point and was quickly killed in turn, but Hadingus was smuggled out in secret to Sweden, where he was fostered by a giant, Wagnofthus, and his daughter, Harthgreppa. Now, this is where the story turns up a notch. You see, all Hadingus wanted to be was a warrior, but the giant Harthgreppa had other desires. Despite being his wet nurse, she eventually seduced him in his adolescence and became his lover. When he came of age, Hadingus decided to head back to Denmark, and the giantess, of course, came with him. On the way, they spent a night in a house whose inhabitants had just died, but as Harthgreppa was a sorceress, she cast a spell that caused one of the corpses to speak. Well, that corpse wasn't too happy and cursed them for eternity, telling them both how they would die. Not long afterward, Harthgreppa's death came true. She was torn to pieces by her fellow giants in a bloodthirsty frenzy. Hadingus went on in silence, though, and became the legendary king that he was worthy of being. His death he kept secret, seeking wisdom from his new patron, Odin. Eventually, after partaking in some mythical acts and winning countless wars until his old age, he brought his subjects to a forest to witness his new revelation. He claimed that only Odin knew his death, and then he hung himself in front of everyone. Next up at number 3, the curse of Andvari's ring. And for this one, we're going to dip a little into Norse mythology, because let's face it, the history of the Scandinavian people was shaped by these skaldic tales that they formed their culture upon. And what if I also told you that the curse of Andvari's ring is also one of the many inspirations of none other than J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings? Yeah, curse ring, Lord of the Rings. Alright, okay, maybe you saw that one coming. But still, in the original legend, one that is scarcely told but is integral to the Volsunga saga, the story focuses on the eponymous ring Andvari, or Andvari's gift, a fabled item that had the ability to make gold. Its creator, Andvari, which is Old Norse for careful one, was a dwarf that lived beneath a waterfall who had the primal power to transform himself into a fish at will. Using the power of the ring, Andvari stockpiled great wealth, but it drew the jealousy of the trickster god himself, Loki. You see, being the resourceful type that he was, Loki used a charm net to capture Andvari whilst he was transformed in a fish, and on condition of letting him go, he demanded the ring and his hoard of gold with it. You see, whilst Andvari reluctantly agreed, he also cursed the ring so that misfortune and peril would befall whosoever possessed it. And that's where the real bulk of this tale begins, because as so far as misfortune goes in Norse mythology, Andvari's ring is chasing the heels of Ragnarok in terms of individuals affected. First, Loki passed on the cursed ring to Hreimdar, king of the dwarves, for accidentally killing his son when he was transformed into an otter. Yeah, dwarves and transforming into animals is a pretty key motif here. Hreimdar was quickly hit by misfortune though when his own son, Fafnir, killed him and stole the ring, where he fled to the mountains, transformed into a fiery and fearsome dragon to protect his hoard of gold. Where have we heard that one before? Fafnir didn't last long though, because soon enough the great hero Sigurd hunted down and killed Fafnir the dragon, taking his ring with him, who he gave to his beloved Brynhilda, the shield maiden, and Valkyrie, where the both of them spent years befallen with tragedy after tragedy. Eventually, Queen Grimhild of the dwarves tricked the couple into marrying into her own family, therefore bringing the curse of the ring full circle. Yeah, exactly. Rock and pool is nice and cool, our only wish to catch a fish. Makes a bit more sense now, right? Coming in at number 2, Lindisfarne. Alright, okay, less mythology now and more actual historic atrocity. Lindisfarne in many ways is perhaps the most important date on the Viking calendar. In more ways than one, it was the birth of the Viking Age. It was the precursor to the many times that these Danish, Norwegian and Swedish warriors would step foot on the shores of Britain, or, well, not quite Britain just yet. Not the mainland anyway. You see, the holy island of Lindisfarne is a tidal island just off of the northeast coast of England in Northumberland. Here it was the site of an incredibly important church in pagan Christianity. It was a peaceful and quiet place dedicated to the production of scripture by its humble monastery. In the year 793 it was said that several months before, foreboding omens came over the land of Northumbria. Whirlwinds far at sea, lightning cracking from beyond the waves, and fiery dragons seen flying in the sky. These signs were followed by a great famine, and then on the 8th of June the Vikings emerged from the mist. As a Northumbrian scholar of Charlemagne's court wrote, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets." You see, the English didn't know what had hit them. The Vikings had perfected the art of shipbuilding and navigation, and they had sailed to a land that they suspected would be filled with riches and resources ripe for the picking. And when they first emerged at Lindisfarne, where the only opposition was holy men in robes, it was like a hot knife through butter. The massacre at Lindisfarne was unprecedented, and in many ways it had only served to further the Vikings' bloody reputation for centuries to come. It sent shockwaves to the rest of Europe, but as history teaches us, that wasn't the last of it. The slaughter at Lindisfarne ushered in a newfound frequency of Viking raids across the coast, as well as in Ireland and France, carving out a brand new period in Britain's bloody history. And finally, coming in at a number 1 spot, the Blood Eagle. Alright, talking of bloody history, our final entry on this list has to be perhaps the most notorious claim in Viking history. Throughout the many sagas of the Viking Age, one term struck more fear into the hearts of those that opposed the Danelaw than anything else. Now, it's also important to note that the so-called Blood Eagle, much like with many things of Norse legend, is possibly as much a fact as it is in fiction. In fact, many historians regard this particular torture method as being so bloodthirsty and grisly that it probably never even happened, but was instead used as a cultural myth to strike fear into the hearts of the Vikings' enemies. I mean, that's also not to say that there are any several historical accounts, because there are, but yeah, just take this one with a pinch of salt. As the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok explains, Jarl Ynar went to Halfdan and carved Blood Eagle on his back. He thrust a sword into his trunk by the backbone and cut all the ribs away, from the backbone down to the loins, and drew the lungs out there. Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement. You see, one of the earliest accounts of the use of the blood eagle is attributed to the death of Ragnar Lothbrok himself. Back in 865, King Yala, who was the then king of Northumbria, had finally captured the legendary Viking leader Ragnar Lothbrok and sentenced him to death by throwing him into a pit of deadly snakes. And before anyone says that the United Kingdom doesn't have any deadly snakes, yes we do. It's the adder, and they're incredibly poisonous. Anyway, in revenge for his death, the sons of Ragnar, led by Ivar the Boneless, led a Viking invasion a year or so later with King Jarl in their sights. And once they finally found him following the Battle of York in 867, Viking legend maintains that Jarl was tortured to death by each of Ragnar's sons by method of the Blood Eagle, where he was kept alive during the grisly and bloodthirsty punishment. You see, whether true or not, Jarl was not the only one to have allegedly succumbed to the Blood Eagle, as many other figures throughout the sagas met the same grim fate. Either it was the most painful and vile punishment imaginable, or it was the scariest story ever told in ancient Nordic history. Either way, it worked.